And then if you see in here, I have the appendix that helps what you need to think about. You need to think about these things. So the appendix helps is like project, and then I'm helping you to walk through what things that you need to do for each of the things, but we're going to talk about this into the detail in next class. Okay, so make sure you come and read. Now in the next class, what we were doing is we talked about how to do the constraints on the table, right? We talked about primary key and a foreign key relationship, right? And then we said the primary key and foreign key relationship, when you build between the table, it helps the data between the table to be the integrity is there between the data. So it means when you have the data in the tables and you build the primary key and a foreign key relationship, you cannot delete the data from the parent table without deleting from the child table. So no child can be orphan. You cannot delete the primary keys without removing the foreign keys, and then you cannot insert any of the foreign keys without reference into the parent table, without being referenced into the table. So that helps to make sure that the data is there is a data integrity. If you say there is a department ID 10, it should exist in the department table, or if you remove the department ID 10, then you first make sure you remove from the foreign key all the department ID 10 to null, or move it to the different department, and then you do it. So we have seen in the Excel sheet. Now we're going to talk about how you can build those into the SQL. Okay, so in the last class where we ended at, we were talking about this one, right? We were talking about creating a table with the constraints, and we talked about if you have the department ID and you have a department table which has a primary key, and if you want to build the foreign key on this table, would you be able to build a foreign key in here? You cannot build it. Why? Because first you need to have a primary key table which is department, so that you can say, okay, the department ID in here is a foreign key which is coming from some different table. So when you build the primary key and a foreign key relationship, first you need to have a table with the primary key, then only you can say the foreign key, right? Otherwise you cannot say from where this department ID is coming, so you cannot build a foreign key relationship. So first primary key is built, and then you can refer it to the another table. You cannot just come and say, oh, I want to build a foreign key on this one. In order to build a foreign key, you need to have a primary key in some other table, right? So that's where we left off, and we have seen on the Excel sheet what is the primary key and a foreign key. Now what we want to do is, I'm going to do, in order to create a department key as a foreign key on the student table, first I'm going to build a department table with the primary key, and then I'm going to create the same table and then build the foreign key on this one. So we're going to see how do you write the syntax to build the primary key and a foreign key relationship. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a table that says department. I'm going to pick the right database. Okay, so first what I need to do, first if I have to create a department ID as a foreign key, what I need to do, I need to build a table where I can say this department ID is coming from some primary key on the other table. So in order to build a foreign key, first I need to have a table with the primary key. So I'm going to create a table with the department name on it. Okay, department, create table name, and then I'm going to say the department ID as an integer. Forget about this right now. Department ID as an integer data type, and this is my primary key, and comma, my second column is name, which is var_50. So if I create this table, this will be my department table with the primary key on department ID. Now once I have the department ID as a primary key, can I build a foreign key on my department ID table? Yes. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to create this table, okay, and I'm going to put this one in here for now. Don't worry about the syntax for now. But what I'm doing is think just this as department ID, integer, and a primary key. Okay, I create the table. All right, now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna make a table with a student, which is basically the same column which we have discussed in the last class: student ID, name, modified date, grade, SSN, zip code, and department ID. Okay, we have seen how can you build the constraints on the table. So I'm gonna say the student ID is the data type integer, and I don't allow the null values, and I make it as a primary key in this table. The student ID, the primary key for this table is the student ID. So you don't have any of the student ID, students get the same student ID. Then you put the name, and then I say you cannot leave the name null. You have to have some name for the student. And then for the modified date, it means when this record last got modified. When did this record got touched? So I said I'm defaulting it to get date. So let's say if you don't put the modified date, the system will automatically put today's date and time in here. So basically saying it's a default is a constraint, and say the value for default get from the system date and time. Okay. Then you do the grade point. We have seen how to apply the check constraint. You do the SSN. So let's say if the student has an SSN, what you do is you say student SSN as an integer data type. Okay. But if you don't put the unique constraint, what could happen? Let's say if some user, let's say if they're typing in from the form, and they are reading from the form and entering the value on as an SSN. You just wanted to make sure that two student doesn't get the same SSN. So you put a unique constraint on the table. It means two student cannot have a same SSN. So let's say if someone is trying to enter an SSN from the other student, by mistake, then when you're trying to insert one student with someone else's SSN, you're gonna get an error. Okay, that's what you want to make sure, that if the SSN is already there in the table, it cannot be reused. Okay, so and then zip code, we talked about the check constraint on the zip code. Now this is the last one, department ID, where you have to build the foreign key. So when you build the foreign key on the department ID, what you do is you say department ID integer, and then you say foreign key. Okay, now with this constraint, you just cannot get away with the foreign key. What you need to do is you need to say, like in here you just said primary key, okay, because this is just for this table. But when you say the foreign key, you need to define two things: the reference for this foreign key, from which table this foreign key is coming, and what is the column name on that table. So you have to provide a reference for the foreign key. So I say foreign key is references to which table? Department Jan that I just created. Okay, so I'm saying that this department ID is from this table, and on this table the column is department ID, which I'm referring as a foreign key in here as a department ID. So it references department Jan and the department ID column in here from this table, and this column is referenced in here as a foreign key. Okay, so whenever you put the foreign key, so you say department ID data type, and then you put the foreign key, and then you make a reference to the table and the column from where this is coming. It means it needs to be a primary key on the table from where it's coming. Does it make sense? So if you, before you can build a foreign key, you need to have the table in order to do a reference. Otherwise you cannot just do like this. Without any reference, you cannot build a foreign key. You have to say from which table this foreign key is coming, and what's the column on that table that you want to refer in here. Okay, so we have seen everything in here. Just the new thing that is how to put the foreign key from the table reference. Okay, that reference is the table. Any question? Mm-hmm. 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 Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, exactly. So you say department ID is a foreign key which is references to this table with this column. Yes. So this is the word which refer to this table in here and this column in here. because the department ID is not in this table, right? It's coming from here. So let's say if you say the student enrolls for the chemistry department, so you go in here, you look, okay, the chemistry department ID is 5, and you put the 5 in here. So basically where are you getting 5 from here. So that's why this is a foreign key in this table, because that column is coming from the department table. Yes. Okay, so now let's say if this is clear, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create, I have already created this one, and if I do try to create this one now, I can create the table, and let's take a look what does it look like. So if I expand in here and I do tables, I have a table with the constraint which has a primary key, and department ID is a foreign key in here. See, and if I look at the department Jan, in here I have the department ID primary key and the name on it. Okay, so if you see on both the tables, you're going to see primary key and a foreign key, what you mentioned in here, and all the constraints. Okay, so now let's say once you're done creating the table with all the constraints, so these are all the types of constraints that we have discussed in the last class that you can apply on the table. Now what would be the next thing? Once you have the table created, what you would be doing, you would be start putting the data into the table, right? Once you start putting the data into the table, what did you say in here for the student ID? What did you say? You said the student ID is a primary key and it cannot be the same for any of the two students. And I guess this would be same with the department ID as well, right? The department ID cannot be same for any of the two departments. Every time you insert a new department, you have to create a unique ID for each of the department, right? So let's say you're inserting the department IDs. Okay, you would be, what you need to do this time for the department ID, do you have to pick the unique IDs by yourself, right? You're just gonna pick one number. Let's say start with the department ID 1, for the next one you put 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, right? So you're gonna go in the sequential order, and you're gonna keep adding the department IDs with the name on it. So can anyone see what would be the problem in here? The problem could be, let's say you add one department today, you come tomorrow, you add another department, you come after a week, you add another department, because this is a growing table where you keep adding the numbers. You kept adding the departments, okay, or you keep adding the students in this table. So in order to add a new student or new department after a week, what do you need to know? What was the last ID that you entered, right? So that you cannot have the same one, you can pick the one after that. So first, before inserting the data, you need to know what is the max of student ID in this table, and then you increment it by 1, and then you enter a new record. Does that make sense? You cannot, because you won't remember what was the last student ID or department ID you entered in the table. When you insert a new record now, you need to know what department ID I can pick, or what student ID I can pick, right? So the process is, you have to make sure that the ID that you are using for the new department or the new student, it's not used. That's the idea, right? And you're going in the sequential order, so sometime you pick 1, you're not going to do that. Sometime you pick 1, another time 100, then 2000, then 10,000. You're not going to pick like random numbers, right? You're always going to go in the sequential order, and you make sure that the department ID is not used. So this is a little bit hassle, that every time you come in for insertion of the record, you have to first check what is the ID I used last, right? The another problem is, let's say if you have multiple users, Adan, me, Victoria, Glishan, everyone is working on the same student table, and we are inserting the student to the table. Now what's going to happen? Let's say Adan checked, okay, there are 10 students in the table. He tried to insert a new record with the student ID 11. At the same time, I went into the table and I checked what's the last student entered. We both saw the last student ID is 10, and then I created, okay, I'm going to create a student ID 11, but Adan looked the first and he created a new, inserted a record into the table. I run my query, it's going to fail because Adan already inserted the student ID in the table, which is student ID 11. So do you see the problem is, when I try to run my query, it's going to fail because I cannot have the same student ID. Then I go and look in, oh, there is someone who entered a record with the student ID 11. I go ahead and try to change it. In between, Victoria came in and she entered a new record with student ID 12. I get again fail. Okay, so do you see the problem is, when there are concurrent user to the database, the ID becomes a problem. you cannot leave the ID to the user. Do you understand? No, you cannot leave the student ID to let pick the user. Let user can pick it. So what you can do is, in the SQL you have a ID column that can be auto generated by SQL. So what SQL will do is, whenever you insert the record, it takes off putting the identity from your plate. SQL server will generate the identity. So what you do is, you just put all the other records in the table. Okay, you don't need to worry about student ID. Whenever you insert the row, it will generate an auto ID for you. It will automatically generate the ID, and it's going to do in the sequential order. So let's say now I'm not going to run into this issue when Adan inserts the student 10 after 11. When I enter my students, it's going to get automatically student ID 12. When Victoria inserts, it's automatically going to go to 13. So what SQL server will do is, it will auto number the students in the order they come into the table. Okay, so let's say first Adan, then me, and then Victoria goes in. So we're going to get 10, 11, 12. Okay, so we don't need to worry about running into each other IDs. Okay, it will solve the problem. And with the first case that we talked about, you don't need to remember what was the ID I inserted last. So every time you come into the table and you keep inserting the students, you just enter these values. So you don't need to worry about what was the last student ID entered, so I don't repeat it. You just leave the SQL server to generate that column value for you, identity value. How do you do that? You do it by using the identity function. So you say, okay, the department ID or the student ID is an identity column, and you say identity 1, 1. What it's going to do is, when you insert the first record into the department table, the identity starts with 1. When you insert the second record, the second record will get the department ID 2. Why? Because you said increment the ID by 1. So when you say 1, 1, it says starts with 1 and increment by 1. When you say 100, 1, what does it mean? The first value for the department ID will be 100. It's going to start from 100, and then it's going to increment by 1. So you're going to get 100, 101, 102. Let's say if you say identity 1000, 1, it means the department ID will start with 1000, 1001, 1002. Okay, so this is the seed and this is the increment. So if you do increment to 5, you're going to have first department ID 1000, then second department ID will be what? It will be, when you increment by 5, the next department ID will be 1005, then 1010. So you're not going to have any IDs in between 1000 to 1005 if you do increment by 5. Okay, so the identity column helps and takes the work of inserting the identity. So same thing can be applied in here on the student table. I take, okay, student ID int not null, and then I can say integer not null, and it could be identity 1, 1. Okay, there is no specific order usually in here when you're putting the constraints. Okay, you can have usually you can have the int identity 1, 1, and you can have not null after. Okay, all right, so the identity column helps user or helps for the table to generate the identity column by itself. You don't need to worry about entering it. So now what is the limitation with this? When you do this, let's say if you want a student to let's say if a particular student you want to assign him a student ID 100, you cannot do it because the SQL server will automatically generate for you. I mean, there are ways around it. You can use identity insert, but when you do that, there is like it skips all the number in between. So but with this one, usually if you have to assign the number, it's not that easy. Okay, so let's say when you're entering it from outside and you want to assign a student ID as 100, you cannot do it from the application or from somewhere. Okay, the SQL server will do it for you. Okay, but I guess that's okay because you just need unique ID for each of the students. So is this clear how you're gonna use the identity column? So let's say how it could be related to your project. When you're creating a customer table, think about this. What you do is you have to generate a customer ID. So you can do the customer ID integer and identity 1, 1 on that table. So when you're entering your customers in the project, you don't need to worry about entering a new customer ID every time. the SQL server will take care of it. Okay. All right. So let's see how this is gonna work. So do I have the department ID identity 1,1? Yes. So let's say, do I have any value in my department table? Right now, no values, right? So if I do select star from department table, there is no record in the table. All right. So what I'm gonna do next is, so the insert is almost done. We are done with how to, sorry, not insert. We are almost done with how to create the tables and how to put the constraints. Now we're gonna start next is the insert. How you're gonna insert the values in the database. Okay. So create, insert, update, all these are very short. You know, we're not gonna spend a lot of time like select, we did like 10 classes or so. In here we're gonna be like moving quickly because there is nothing much to see. You know, all here is the syntax, and you need to think about what you need to do, for what kind of constraints you want to put. That's it. There are no variations, not much like that, other than like picking up the data types. Okay. So in here I say select star from department table. There is no record in the department table. Now I want to insert departments in my table. So what do you need to do? How do you write an insert statement to insert the data into the table? Once you create the table, how do you insert? So it's, the first thing is, it would always be a good practice to put all the values in the single quotes. So let's say if we are entering the value for any of the columns in here, you always put them in the single quotes. Okay. I told you any of the values that you put in the where condition, where employee ID equals to 1, always put in the single quotes. Since day one we are talking about this. The same thing, because that's a data value, you always put this data value in the single quotes. Okay. So how do you write the statement for inserting into the table? For writing the statement to insert into the table, you say insert into department gen. You do this and you say this. Okay. Insert into department table name, and then you do is, on which column do you want to insert? Do you want to insert anything on the department ID? Yes or no? Do you want to insert anything into the department ID? No. Why? Why you don't want to insert anything? Because it's an identity already. So that's, it's auto generated by system. Good. So what you're gonna say is insert into the department table, and then in the parentheses you have to say on which column you are inserting the data. So you're gonna say, okay, I'm gonna insert only into the name column. Okay, so in the parentheses you put the name. So let's say if you are inserting in multiple columns, all you do is you put comma and you put the column name. So you put all the columns on which you're going to insert the data, you put it comma separated, and then close the parentheses. Okay. So right now I have only one column, so that's why only I have one column name in the parentheses. The next thing you do is you say values. So values is basically what you're going to insert the values for the name column. So you say values, in the parentheses you will say, okay, this is my name of the department. Okay, so the values are in the parentheses. So this is your department 1, so this is your row 1, and then you do is comma separate, and then put the another value in the parentheses, then put a comma separation, then you put another department. So what you're doing is you say value, in the parentheses you will put all the values that you have for. So if I have more than one column, all the values goes in here comma separated. Okay, so if I have more than one column mentioned in here, I would be going like this. First row will get the column value, the second column value, and the third column value. So right now if I just have one column, all I'm gonna do is in the parentheses I'm gonna say single quotes and chemistry. Okay, and then I'm gonna close the bracket, I'm gonna say comma my next value, and then comma the next value for it. Okay, so that's it for the insert. So if I run this, it will insert 3 rows into the table. Okay, so if I do select star from department gen, see it has done the department ID auto generated, and then it got 3 rows in here with one chemistry, then physics, and then biology. Okay, so that's how you can insert the data into your table. Is it clear? The another way of doing an insert is you can use the GUI, the graphical user interface. What you can say is I want to say, you click on edit top 200 rows, and then you can insert the rows into the table. But when you go in the company, you wouldn't be using this one, because usually the data is not inserted from the SSMS, because the data is inserted from the applications, which is like web applications. You go to the website and you would be entering the data, and it would be getting it saved into the databases. So you need to write the statements. You cannot do like this, because you don't in the actual world, you don't go in here and insert the data. You usually write statements, and these statements are run by the application, so you have to know the statements. You cannot, this is the shortcut to do it, but you cannot get away with it, because let's say if a person who uses the Internet Explorer, he's entering some of the information. Let's say when you go online and you fill out your information, your name, first name, your phone number, your address, where does that go? It gets saved somewhere into the database. So when you have to save, you have to write this statement to save the values into the table. Okay, so this is must, but I'm saying you the other way would be, you can just come in here and you can say, okay, this is a department which is zoology. Okay, all right. Oops. And then you click close, it will automatically add a new row into the table. So if I select start from department, it gets 1004. So that's the another way of entering. You can just right click and say edit top 200 rows, and you keep entering your rows into the table. Okay, is it clear? All right, so yes, yeah. Yes. Yep. So now think about this. I will ask you this question. Can you insert the record into this table first, saying that without inserting records into this department table, can you insert record in this table, into the student table? Let's say I say I have a student who enrolled in the department arts. Can you insert the student directly in here? Let's say I have a new student came in who enrolled in the arts. Can you insert the row in the student table? What kind of relationship exists between these two tables? Primary key and a foreign key. So yes, right. So can you enter the student with the arts department in here directly? Just go in and then insert the row in here. Can you do that? So what information would you need in order to insert the student with the art department? You need the department ID for the arts, right? Or no? Do you have it in here? Do you have arts? No. Do you have the department arts in the department table? You don't have it, right? Yes. So what I'm trying to say is, can you insert the record into the student table first with the student enrolled in the department arts? You cannot. Yes, exactly. So that, yes, parent child foreign key, or like a child cannot be orphan. So you cannot just say, oh, department ID 1005 would be the next one, let me insert the student ID in here with department ID 1005. You cannot do that. First you have to insert in here, then only you can insert the rows in here. Does it make sense? Even though you know the art's gonna get 1005, you cannot just do that. You cannot insert the student with the department ID 1005 in here. If it's not in here, first you make a row in here, then you insert the student. Okay, all right. Coming to next, we're going to see how to do it. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to start entering the student in the table, okay, because I have the departments created first so that I can insert some students and enroll into the department. So what I told you, how do you do insert into the table? You say insert into table name, right? And then what do? You put the parentheses and you put the column names in which you would be entering the data. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I'm going to insert into this table, and I'm going to insert into which column? Do I need to insert anything into the student table? Oops, hold on. I'm going to take the identity column out from this one. Okay, so I can just for now I can show you the thing that the student ID, if it's without identity column, how do you insert it? Okay, so let me drop and recreate the table because I don't want the identity column on the student ID. Okay, I drop the table and I recreate without identity column. So I don't have an identity column on student ID. I have to insert my own student ID every time I insert a record. Okay, so see in here what I'm going to do. I'm going to say insert into the student table. Which columns I'm going to insert? I'm going to insert into the column name student ID. Okay, so you can have student, so it doesn't matter what's the order in here. Whatever column that you want to insert, you can just put those column names in here and you can insert it. So I say in this table I'm going to insert the name, the grade, the student ID, then zip code and department ID. Okay, these are the columns that I want to insert the value for. Okay, it doesn't matter, it doesn't has to be in this order. All you need to do is make sure this order is followed in your values. Okay, so when you put the name, your first column would be name when you're inserting. Your grade, second would be your grade. Student ID, then student ID. The zip code, and then department ID. Okay, make sense? So what I'm going to say, insert into table all the columns in the parentheses that I want to insert, and then values, and this column, all these values for each of these corresponding columns in here. The first is the name, so first would be name. The grade, second would be grade. Student ID, zip code, department ID. Okay, so can I insert this row into the table? Do anyone see any problem with this data? Is this gonna fail or it would run fine? Let's try it. See, it failed. Why does it fail? Foreign key constraint, right? So what is happening? Look at this one. What I'm trying to do for department ID, what value I'm trying to enter? 2. Does the 2 in here? No. So if you have the wrong value for the department ID, you cannot insert it. So that's the advantage of having a primary key and a foreign key relationship. You cannot insert. So let's say I change it to 1001. Okay, now if I try to insert, I can do it. I mean, it goes through, right? Because all of the constraints are satisfied that you have put on the table that you put it. So now let's look at what happened in the student table. Let's take a look. How does it look like what we just entered? If I select, you had the student ID in here which got through. You had the name of the student, it's in here. Did you enter the modified date? You entered grade? Yes. You didn't enter SSN. You entered the zip code and you entered department ID. Did you enter modified date? No, right? Did you enter modified date in here? No. Then how did it came through? How does the value get populated? Thank you. Yes, because you had the constraint on the table that you said this row was last modified on this date and it has a default value of get date and time. So that's why it automatically got populated from the 8/30/2017, which is approximately this time. Right? Yep. So good catch. The modified date, even though you didn't put it, you know when. So now if I ask you, let's say if you come up after like 3 or 5 days, if I ask you when this record get entered into the table, you can look at the modified date and tell me, you know. Okay, now see in here, what was the problem when you don't use the identity column? You started with student ID, it will let you allow to do it. Then the next person come in can use the student ID 4. So that's why the ID won't be maintained in a sequence, and then the other problem is with the concurrent user, so that's why you try to do the identity column. Okay, let's try to do a new entry to the student table. What I'm going to say, I'm going to make a student ID 4, the name, the grade point, SSN, zip code, department ID, and the modified date. When if I put the modified date value in here, what's going to happen? It would be fine, because if you provide the value for modified date, it will be overwritten with the default value. So the default value is only used in a case you don't provide it. When you provide the value for the modified date, when the user will provide the modified date, system will take that date. Okay, so it's okay, you can mention the modified date in your insert statement if you want. Okay, all right, so let's try to run this one and see what do we get. I run this, I get the record in the student table. So see, I have inserted with the modified date, which is what I mentioned. Okay, if I try to insert this record again, what's going to happen? So let's say if you do a double click on this record by mistake, what's going to happen? Can anyone tell me? Would it be a duplicate row inserted in here? I run this its second time, it's giving me an error. What error it's giving? Read this error. Why it's giving an error? Sorry? Yes, you're saying it right. Yes. Yeah, it cannot be duplicated. Why? Because what's the value you're trying to insert for the student ID, which is 4? Does it already exist in the table? Yes. So can you insert a student ID 4 again in the table? No. Why? What is the restriction that you put on the table that doesn't allow you to do the duplicate? What's the restriction? Look at the table. What constraint is not allowing you to put the duplicate values for the student ID? What was the constraint? What's the constraint on the table? The primary key constraint, right? Yes, the primary key constraint. What does the primary key says? What does the primary key constraint says? It cannot be duplicated. So that's why you cannot insert the same row again with the same student ID. I mean, not same row, even if you try to insert everything different and just keep the student ID 4, you won't be able to insert because the student ID is same. So it's giving an error because you have a primary key in the student table and you're trying to insert the same primary key. That's why. Okay, all right. Yeah. It will allow it. Maybe not. You need to think about, let's try to run this and see. So maybe not, because we need to see what error. So if I change the student ID to 5 and I try to insert, let's see if I can insert. I cannot insert it. Now read the error, what the error says. What's the violation? Unique key constraint. Now read, cannot insert a duplicate key in the object this. The duplicate value is this, which is this. So what is this? What is this? Yes. 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 So because even though you're trying to insert the same student with the different student ID, you cannot insert, because on the SSN you put the SSN has to be unique for each of the students. If it's not, then it gives you this error. even though you changed the student ID, but you had another constraint that restricted to insert. So if you don't had this unique constraint, you might be able to insert it, right? If you don't had the unique constraint on the table, it might let you pass through. So that's why you need to have the constraints on the table so that it allows the restrictions, Okay. So what we are trying to see in here is we are trying to see what will happen when you have the constraints on the table and you try to violate. So we have seen if you violate the unique constraint key, you're gonna get the error. If you try to violate the primary key, you're gonna get an error. If you try to do a violation for foreign key, you're gonna get an error, right? So we're just trying to test all the constraints that we built. Is it working or how does it work? We're trying to see those. All right. So now let's say if I'm trying to do another student in here, which his name is Andy again, and the department ID 1002, can I insert this thing? Would this succeed or would be failed? This would be what gonna be happen with? Yes, say that. Yeah, I didn't insert it yet, but what's gonna happen? It's gonna fail or pass. It will insert the record. It will fail. Why? No, 1002 is what? No. 102 is what? It's a department ID, so you can have multiple students for the department. So it should be fine with the it's not an error with the department ID. So let's try to run it and see if it fails. No. So okay. So I ran this statement and it gives me an error. Read what the error is. No, the department ID is not unique. Did you put the unique constraint on the department ID? No. Right. So that's not an error. So it's saying the duplicate value is null, and for the unique constraint, right? So on which column you have the unique constraint? On which column on the table you have the unique constraint? Social security. So and then it's saying that you're trying to insert a value which is already exists. What's the value already exists in the table? Null. So see, does the null exist in the table? For the other student, right? For the student ID 2, already null exists for the SSN. And now you're trying to do the null also for the student ID 5. You cannot do that. Because what does the unique constraint says? Unique constraint say you cannot have a duplicate values. So no two student can have two null values. Because if the two students have the null values, then it will become duplicate. So because it has a unique constraint, you cannot insert one more null for the other student. You need to have the SSN for that. I mean, the first student is fine. It can be inserted as a null because it's a unique key. And now if you try to insert another student with the null SSN, you cannot do it because it has the unique constraint. So that's why it's failing. So let's say what you need to do. All you need to do is you're gonna change in here and you're gonna say, okay, I want to put the value for the SSN, which is nothing but, let's say I put his SSN as 1805. Would this work now? Yes, it will work. So see, one row affected. I can insert because I have the unique value for the SSN. The department ID it doesn't need to be unique. It can be same, because on here I don't have the unique key on the department ID. It's just a foreign key. So the foreign key will check, does 1002 exist in the department table? Yes, it does. So it will allow you to pass through. But if I instead of 1002 I have used the one department ID, it might fail. It will fail, I mean. Okay, so because you're using the valid department ID, it passes. Okay, so it's only going to check for the department ID, whether it exists or not in the department table. Clear? Okay, so now I have a problem in here. One thing, do you see what happened is for the first student you entered, it got a null SSN. Let's say this is a bug in the system. You shouldn't allow null SSN value. What code you have to change in your table so that no null value is allowed for the SSN? What would you make a change in here? So let's say when you wrote the table, the bug was there and the student got entered with null SSN. So what you do is you found out student ID 2 SSN, you fix it. But when you enter another student with the SSI null, it will make an entry because now that is also unique, right? So what I'm saying is once you update the SSN, the another student can come with the null SSN, right? So what your manager wants is he don't want SSN to be null. What would you make change in here so that SSN cannot be null anytime? Perfect. Thank you. Yes. So you're gonna put SSN unique not null in here, and that would make sure that no null value is inserted. So this column can never be null then. Can never be null when you put the not null constraint. Good. So that's how you're gonna need to implement the things when the requirement changes, you know. Yes. Good job. So no, it's not unique. Say that again. In here. Okay. Are you talking about the student table or the department table? Which table you're talking about? So the department table, it has to be unique because in here you have a primary key on that. So it has to be unique in the department table. Yes. Yes. Because it has a primary key, you cannot repeat the value for this. So no two department, you cannot, you're not going to insert chemistry 2 times in the same right in the table. You cannot insert 1 more time chemistry, right? So no two department can have same department ID, right? Yeah. Okay, so each department you insert in here should always get with a unique ID. That's why you have a primary key on the table. Okay, so now let's see what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this out and I'm gonna say this as null. Would this be fine if I say null and then I leave the department ID as is and I change student SSN and then I change, because I already have the 5, I say this as 6. Would this work? So student ID is unique. I'm gonna enter this as 6. The 6 doesn't exist. The name, I'm entering null. The department ID, I'm entering 1002, which exists. And this SSN, I'm entering 2025, which is also unique. So would this make an entry to the table? Or it will fail? Let's execute and see. Why? On the name, yes, was the restriction. So that's why. So see, when you put lots of data constraints to get the good quality of data, you're gonna get good quality, you know, because user won't be able to fool around with those kind of things. Okay. Yes. Good. So now let's see the next one. So once you've put the name in here, you would be able to get through. Okay. All right. So now what I'm trying to see is, yes. So what kind of constraints you have on the zip code or the grade? So grade has to be in between 1 and 4, right? So let's try to do enter a grade with so let's say I'm gonna make it to 6. Okay, leave the student as is. You can have multiple NDs, and then you put the grade as, let's say, 5.6. Would this be correct? Would this be correct? No. Why? When you run this query, see what does it says. The insert statement failed because of the check constraint. The conflict occurred in the database with the column grade. Why? Because in the grade you're trying to insert 5.6, which is not a valid value. The valid value range is this. Grade has to be greater than 1 and less than 4. Okay? Is it clear? Okay, so you cannot violate any of the constraints. So once you put the correct range, it automatically going to take it. So same way you have a range on the zip code. Okay, zip code has to be greater than 1 and 4 zeros, and it has to be less than 99999, assuming that you are entering a US zip code. Okay, so because in US you have a zip code which is 5-digit, let's say, so that's why you put the check constraint on the zip code, so they don't try to insert 00000 for the zip code. Okay, something like that, or they don't enter like a 6-digit zip code. So this will prevent entering 6-digit zip code. Okay, all right. So is it clear how do you insert the records into the table? You can insert multiple records into the table, right? So what I'm going to do is, if I have to insert multiple students together, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say insert into the student table, the name of the table, insert into student, and then I'm going to say let's say I'm going to say if I have a column as an let's say now my student ID is a identity column. Okay, you make the student ID as an identity column. So you're going to say, okay, the name, comma, grade, or the modified date, then comma, you have the grade point, then you put SSN, then you put zip code, and then you put the department ID. Okay, so when you want to insert multiple data into the table, you put the values in the one row, and then with the comma you're just going to mention all the values that you want. So this is your student 1, this is your student 2, this is your 3, 4, 5, and 6. So you can enter multiple, just all you need to do is put comma and put the one row value in the one parentheses. Okay, make sense? So you can insert multiple rows together. You don't have to do one by one, you don't have to do one by one. You can do multiple entries together in one go. Is it clear? So that's what we did with the department. When we inserted 3 rows together, but here there was just one column, so that's why I only had one value in the parentheses. But here I am entering into the multiple columns, that's why I have multiple values in the parentheses separated by comma. Okay, is this clear? How do you do insert to the table? Okay, all right, so this is gonna come by practice. This is all just you need to remember is how do you write a syntax for insert into table name, then all the column list, and then you use the values and you put in parentheses all the values, right? It's gonna come by practice. It's the same for the create table, it's gonna come by practice. All right, so what you can do is, if you don't remember the syntax for creating the table, you can right click, you can say new, and you can say table. When you say click new table, this is the GUI. You shouldn't be using this one. Maybe I was thinking if there was a script that you can look. No, it doesn't allow description. Okay, anyways, I mean, if you have to look any table and you don't remember the exact statement for creating the table, you can right click on the existing table and you can say script table as create to new window. What it's going to do is it's going to script out the table for you, but it comes with lot of things you have to take that out. So if I take this all these things out from the table, all I remain with the statement that I return for creating the department table. Okay, so I mean it comes with all of the other things, extra things, but you can see you have the statement in here, create table name and the columns. Okay, all right. So you can refer to the statements by using right click and say create table as create to, script table as create to. Okay, all right. Now let's try to do some insertion. Is we are almost done. We have seen how to do an insertion. We're gonna see the advanced insertion, but first what I'm gonna tell you is in my department table, okay, which is my department table, department underscore Jan. So if I do, yeah, so if I do select star from department Jan, can I delete department 1002 from the table? Can I do delete department ID 1002 from the table? Can I delete it? Why? Yes, yes. So if you have a department ID 1002 used in here, you cannot delete because it will become orphan. This child will become orphan, so you cannot delete 1002. Can you delete 1004? Yes, because the department ID 1004 doesn't exist in here. So how do you write a delete statement when you have to delete the data from the table? How do you write it? All you need to do for the deletion is, first, let's say I'm saying I want to delete department ID 1002. So I'm going to write a select statement, and then what do I see in here? I'm seeing department ID 1002 and physics, right? So I said select star from table name where department ID equals to 1002, which will give me only one row. So you make sure this is the one row you want to delete, and you replace delete star, select star with the delete. And if you run this, it's a correct delete statement. Okay, so all you do is you write first the select statement for getting the data that you want to delete, and then you replace select star with delete. Okay, so all I need to do is if I try to delete 1002, let's say first I try to delete 1004, I can delete it. See, I can delete it because it's not reference. But if I try to delete 1002, I would be in trouble. I mean, I cannot delete it because of the 1002 exists in the table. So that's what you're getting the message. Delete cannot be done because you have a constraint with this department ID column on this table. Is a foreign key constraint. Okay, all right. So now, I mean, you can do 1004 but not 1002. So if I look into the table, that 1004 is gone but not 1002. Okay, so what's the statement for deleting the data from the table? Delete, instead of select star you would be putting delete. So delete from table name, and you have to put the filter. What will happen if you don't put the filter? It will delete everything from the table. It will delete everything from the table. Okay, so if you don't put the where condition, it's going to delete everything from the table. Okay, so right now you cannot delete it because there is a primary key and a foreign key constraint. But let's say if you don't have a constraint and then by mistake you don't put the where condition and you do the delete from the table, everything will be deleted, and there is no way to recover the data once it's deleted. So you will be in trouble by that time if you try to do delete from table and it's you don't want to delete everything. Okay, all right. So we're gonna see how you can prevent those kind of things. How do you prevent, like if you run into the situation, what are accidental situation? By accident you do run this command. So we're gonna see it cannot be prevented completely. You have to do some you have to take some measures in order to prevent this. So we're going to see it in further classes. But what I'm trying to say in here is, make sure first write the select statement, make sure that's what you want to delete, and then try to convert, then try to do delete. Okay, so never ever run this delete directly. If you run this and you don't have primary key and a foreign key constraint, the data will be deleted from the table and will never be recovered. Okay, and it makes a trouble for you. Okay, so always a good idea is for now to first write the select statement and make sure that's the row you want to delete, and then change this thing into delete. Okay, and then run this statement. Okay, so you know this row will be deleted now. Okay, all right. Okay, so did you understood what delete will do? Delete from table name. Does delete drops the table? No, it just deletes the data. So what does delete will do is deleting the data. So how many statements we had when we were started with? We had select, update, insert, and delete. So we have seen select, how to insert the data, and how to delete the data from the table. Okay, so we're gonna start update. We're gonna see in more advanced cases for this one, right? Okay, but is it the basic idea is clear? How do you do delete? How do you do insert? How do you do create the tables? The create table with the constraints is finished. All we need to do is little advanced for the insert and little advanced for the delete. Okay, I mean, delete would be always, whenever you want to delete the data, you can get from the table by writing your select statement and just convert everything before from would go to delete. That would be the making the delete statement. So first, in order to do a write or delete, I always do this still. I first write select and make sure all those rows that I want to delete appears in the delete statement, not more, not less, and then I convert that so that I know what I'm going to delete from the table. Okay, that's always a good practice, so you can see what you're going to delete from the table. So if you know how to write select, delete is easy. Okay, all right. So now what do we want to do is, we want to see, this is this would be useful when you are collecting the data from the form from the internet, right? When you are collecting the data from the form, you can write these kind of statements, and that will collect the data from the application, or from you can insert one by one. Now we're going to talk about how can you insert the data into the bulk. Let's say you have to copy the data from one table to the other table. Okay, or you want to copy whole table, whole data, everything from somewhere else. So let's say from AdventureWorks you want to copy the data in this database, which is employee table. Okay, you want to make a copy of employee table. How to do those? So when you are making a copy of employee table in this database, what two things you need to do? First, you need to create the table and then move the data, right? So let's say if I ask you, can you make a copy of AdventureWorks in this database? What two things you need to do? Make a copy of the table structure. It means you have to create a table, and then you have to insert the data, right? So you're not gonna create a table by writing the statement, because you just need to copy, and then you're not gonna insert 290 rows one by one, right? That's not a good way. So we're gonna see how to do a bulk insert. Before that, anyone have any questions? Okay, so what I want to do is, when you go home, try to practice creating the table and inserting the data for the project that we talked. Okay, initially when we started the class, you will be doing that. Okay, so think about creating a movie table and then trying to put the movie names and put the director names in there. Okay, create a customer table, put some columns, and think about how I can generate the customer data. Those might not be the final table, but you are practicing and moving towards step by step, and you're gonna evolve the table what you need, for the project with that case. So now let's see how can you do create a table and insert the data as well. Okay, so let's say if I have to copy an employee table from human resources.employee into my database, which is training database. Okay, so what I'm saying, do I have an employee table in here in this database? I don't. I have only 4 tables. What I want is, I want to copy this AdventureWorks human resources.employee table in this database, what I have in here. So if I do the select statement, what I would be writing, select star from adventureworks.humanresources.employee. I execute, I get the employee table. Can anyone tell me, I mean, you won't know, but can anyone guess how I can run the employee table in this database? How I can access the human resources.employee table in this database? It doesn't exist in here, right? It exists in the AdventureWorks. So how I can access the table when I'm pointing in here with the SQL training database, and I can access the employee table. Why I can access is because I'm mentioning get the human resources.employee table from this database. So if you put the database name and then put .table name, it doesn't matter where you are, it will automatically pull the table from this database. Okay, so let's say if you don't put this one, what's gonna happen? Do you have this table in here? No. So if you try to execute, you're gonna get an error. But you know this table is in my AdventureWorks database. So you say AdventureWorks, the database name, .table name, it doesn't matter where you're pointing right now. No matter where you point, pick anyone, whatever you see. If I pick this one and I run this table, it's gonna run fine because it knows I need to get the table data from this AdventureWorks, not what mentioned in here. So basically when you put the name, it overwrites this. It doesn't look at this because it thinks it says this is the correct one that I need to look. Okay, is this very clear? Okay, so now what do I want to do is I want to create a copy of this table into this training database. Okay, so what you can do is there is a very simple statement. You can say into and then the name of the table that you want to create. Okay, so what it's going to do is, you're saying into employee, it means it's going to copy this table into an employee table name, or you can say copy of employee copy. Okay, so what it's going to do is it's going to create a table name employee underscore copy, where it's going to create on this one. Okay, it's going to create an employee copy on this database because you just mentioned the table, you didn't mention the database. Then which database it's going to pick? This one for this table. Okay, so what it's going to do is it's going to create a table called employee underscore copy in this database, and where it's going to copy from? It's going to copy from this one. So this into statement will copy the table and the data in this table, whatever the name you mention in here. So I run this command, it says 290 rows affected. What this thing did, it did two things. It created the table and it put the whole data into the employee copy table. So if I refresh my database, in order to see the table that we just created, I need to right click and I say refresh and go to the tables. You're gonna see the table employee copy is created. So this into thing just not created the table, it put the data in. So if you look in here, you have the employee table created with the data as well. Okay, so the into things did two steps. Created a table structure, okay, which is the create statement. It does everything for you, and then copies everything from that table. Okay, so isn't it a nice statement? Whenever you have to copy the table, you can use this command to copy the table and the data. Okay. Okay. All right. So what you can do is you can access the employee table with select star from employee underscore employee table. From this database you can, so let's say if you want to practice something on update insert on the employee table, you can copy the table in your database and you can do everything you want from here. If you want to delete all the records from this employee table, fine, I don't care about it. So when you say delete from employee underscore copy, what's gonna happen? What's gonna happen when you're gonna do this? It's gonna delete the sorry, it will delete the whole data from the table. When you say it deleted everything, the structure is there, just the structure. There is no data in this table anymore. So if I try to do select star from employee copy, you deleted everything from the table. The structure is there. You didn't delete the table. You just deleted the data. Okay. So all you wanted to do was you wanted to delete, let's say, one employee, and you say delete from employee copy, and you didn't put the where employee ID equals to 1, and you run this. It's gone. Now it cannot be recovered. I mean, you have the copy, you can create it. Yeah. Yes. A new table? Yes, you can do that. Yes. So your question is you want to create a table, just the table copy. You don't want the data from the table, right? That's where you're going. And then you want to change the existing table, right? So that you can have like new table. Yes. So instead, you don't need to do it in 2 steps. What you can do is when you are copying the table, you just need the structure. That's what I'm coming next. You just need the structure. What you can do is if you don't want to copy the data, let's say I'm going to copy just the structure. Okay. Structure means the table with no data in it. Okay. So I want to create a table, but with no, it's not complete. You say, okay, I want to create an employee table, but I want the structure. What do you need to do? So you say why it's copying the data, because when you run this select statement, it has all the data. That's why it's copying the data in the structure as well. So what do you make this SQL statement so that it doesn't copy the data? So let's say if you say in here where employee ID is equals to 0, does this return anything? Does this query return anything? No. So now when you do into this table, it's not gonna copy the data because this query doesn't return anything. So when you run this, it's gonna create a table employee structure and see 0 rows affected. Why? Because this query doesn't return any rows. So the table is created. So you don't need to do delete from table name. You know, you can do directly this. Just copy the structure. So think about if you're thinking to do a table which is 1 million rows, when you're gonna create a copy 1 million rows, copying the table and the data from one table to another, it might take 5-10 minutes. And then you delete it, it takes another 5-10 minutes. So you can save the time by just putting the where condition in here. So when you create a table, I'm going to do the refresh to get the table employee structure. There is nothing in here. You just made a copy of the table with no data by just putting the where condition. No, I didn't change it right now. Oh, you have to change it now. We're going to see it. We're going to see how can you change the column name and how can you alter the constraints. So the next topic would be if you have the existing table. So let's say you have this employee structure table. Now what do you want to do is you want to change the table column names. How do you change the name of the columns? Or if you have to change the constraints on the table and you want to say I don't want employee ID to be not null, I will allow the employee ID to be null. Or you want to put a unique constraints on the employee ID. You know, you want to put a primary constraints. How do you make these changes when you have the table? How do you do that? So for this we're gonna use the alter command, which we're gonna learn in the next or 2 class. So we will be using, instead of create, now we will be using the alter statement to alter the existing table. And we're gonna see the other reasons why do you have to use the alter. Okay, but good question though. You cannot right now change it. We need to see how to do the alter. Okay, but it's a good segue to the next topic. So did you understood how when you're doing it, how can you copy the data using into statement? This is very powerful. You know, when you have to just create the structure, when you just have to when you have to do copy both structure and the data, you're gonna use into. All you need to do is you just need to take this out, where condition, and then you run the query. It's gonna create a table with the data. Data. No, no, no. For no. So now let's see what you want to do is you don't want this table anymore in the database. You want to drop the table, you know. So delete the data and drop the table. So the statement is drop. Okay, so drop table name. So let's say you want to drop this employee copy table which you just created, you don't need anymore. You say drop table name. This will drop the whole structure of the table. Once you execute, and now if I refresh this database, I'm not gonna have the employee copy in here because you dropped the table. So this is when you write the drop statement, it will do both things. If there is a data in the table, it will be deleted and the table will be dropped. So the structure is also, so the drop will do two things: delete the data and drop the table. Okay, because it cannot hold the data without the structure of the table or the create tables, right? So when you're dropping the, if you don't need the table, you use the drop table name. Where does it come from? When you create table, you say create table name, right? So when you drop the table, you say drop table name. Okay, so basically you're dropping one of the object from the database by saying drop table name. So this kind of, yeah. No, it won't do the same thing. The structure would be still there. So the table would still be there with no data in it. When you do delete from table name, it will just delete the data. It will leave the table as is. Empty table would be there. When you do delete, the empty table would be there, but drop would do, you're not gonna find the table in the database anymore. Yep, we're gonna see the drop as well. It's gonna come one by one. So I don't want to go into the detail, but I just want to show you what is the difference between drop and delete. We're gonna get into the detail of drop, delete, everything. Okay, so in the next class, what do we gonna see is, so let's say you have this empty table now. Okay, now you have this empty table. What Glishan told me is he want to change some column names in here. He wants to do some alter the constraints. He does those things. Okay, don't worry about it. He does those things. Let's say he knows how to do it. He altered the column names and he had changed some constraint. Now let's say he want to copy the data from the employee table. Okay, he wants to copy the data from the employee table. How can he do that now? He don't want to copy the structure. He has the existing structure and he wants to copy the data into the existing structure. So in order to copy the data into the existing structure, we're gonna see in the next class how you can copy the data into the existing structure of the table from the database. Okay, so because we are already over time, so we're gonna start in the next class. Okay, how can you do the copy of the data into the existing structure? So let's say you made the changes to the table and now you want to copy the data. How would you do that? Okay, to an existing table. You cannot use into, because when you use the into, it copies the structure as well. So the into will not be helpful this time when you have the structure. So we're gonna see the different method. How do you use it? Okay. All right. Any questions? No class Monday. Yes. Thank you. Yes, Wednesday. All right. Yes. Sure.